Hello everyone. One of the biggest and most heated debates in the Deltarune community currently is the question everyone wants to know. Just who is this fella? This video isn't meant to be like some definitive answer to the question, but rather my theory as to who they are, and the pros and cons we currently have with each candidate. But before we get into that, let's first discuss what we definitively know about the Knight. So we know that the Knight's main goal is to bring about the Roaring, a cataclysmic event that will lead to the world falling into chaos. This event is caused by the creation of too many dark fountains, which will lead to titans forming from the fountains and causing mass destruction. After this occurs, the Darkners will be turned to stone, and the remaining Lightners will be forced to fend for themselves in eternal darkness. We first learn about the Knight in Chapter 1 from Sham. He tells us that the Knight appeared recently and locked away 3 of the 4 kings that ruled over Card Kingdom. The last king, the King of Spades, was left to rule as an absolute monarch. When we fight King at the end of Chapter 1, he states that he will destroy us by the Knight's will, showing that he and the Knight are collaborating. King states that the Darkners have purpose now after the arrival of the Knight. This further shows us that the King has a strong distaste for Lightners due to him being locked away in an old, unused classroom without purpose. King seems to believe that opening more Dark Fountains will lead to the expansion of the Dark World, rather than bring about the Roaring. This seems to imply that the Knight left out this information intentionally to get the King on their side. We know that if too many Dark Fountains are opened, all Darkners will be turned to stone. After defeating Jevil and talking to Sham states that Jevil began to change after meeting a strange someone. Sham was forced to lock Jevil away after this. However, this is implied to have happened a long time ago. When talking about the Knight, it seems that their appearances only occurred recently. This implies that whatever happened with Jevil was unrelated to the appearance of the Knight. In Chapter 2, the Sweet Cat Cakes mentioned that the Queen became worse whenever the Knight showed up. After this, the Queen developed an obsession over the Knight and the fountain, becoming all that she would talk about. Later we see Swatchlings in Queen's mansion watching a video of the Knight creating the fountain. They say that the Knight created the fountain and this world. Later, in the first battle of Queen, she again mentions that the Knight created this world. After this, Queen's monologue gives us a lot of lore about the Knight. She's the first to call the Knight the Roaring Knight. Noted the Roaring, of course, is the cataclysmic event we talked about, but this further solidifies that this is the Knight's primary objective. It's likely that the Knight referred to itself as the Roaring Knight to Queen, as we see that Queen is oblivious to what the Roaring actually is. We also hear that the Knight courses will or determination to create the cyberworld. This heavily implies that the Knight, to an extent, is a Lightner. The Queen, as well as King, who desperately wants to, seem to lack the ability to create a Dark Fountain. We later see that Susie has no problem creating a Dark Fountain in Chapter 4, even if it is all screwy. We see that Birdly, as well, is able to, or at least attempt to, create a Dark Fountain within the Dark World. Also, one more thing to note, when Rousey's talking about the Roaring, the Titans we see heavily resemble the Knight's appearance. Lastly, Spamton briefly mentions the Knight. He starts to say that the Knight, and then gets cut off. He starts apologizing. It's clear that someone is censoring him from revealing more information to us about who the Knight is. And Orange Addison in the Trash Zone tells us that Spamton was initially a failure. Extremely desperate, he managed to make the right phone call, or perhaps someone made the right phone call to him. Regardless, he became extremely successful and was on the phone all the time. Spamton's success could be related to the Knight, as we see the Knight has a tendency to make deals. In Chapter 3, we finally get to see the Knight. First, we learn a little bit about Tina. So we learned that Tina was business partners with Spamton. He kind of got betrayed by Spamton when Spamton vanished. This left him hopeless and without any future. That is, until the Knight came along. We know that Tina is trying to stop the Fun Gang from getting Toriel. He states that he was told by the Knight to keep the Fun Gang busy. If he did so, he would have all the people watching him that he could want. This continues the Knight's common characteristic of manipulating desperate people. Ultimately, Tina is won over by Susie and Rousey's kindness to him. When Tina is giving Toriel back to the Fun Gang, his arms are suddenly slashed off by the Knight due to his betrayal. We then begin to fight with the Knight. If you successfully get the Knight to a low enough HP, the fight will end with Susie and Rousey getting taken down by an evil Nike logo. And Chris will be knighted by the Knight. If you are to beat this fight without taking a single hit, Chris will cough, leading to the Knight tilting their head. This is likely Chris signifying to the Knight to end the fight, as it's just what they do after. This entire fight pretty much shows us that the Knight and Chris are in cahoots with each other to some capacity. Regardless, after the fight, the Knight tries to absorb Toriel. I'm not really sure what they're doing here, but they do like make some kind of beam thing. Anyway, they get interrupted by Undyne, who is then captured by the Knight. Also, one thing I kind of forgot to mention, we also see the Knight constantly shapeshift throughout this fight, which is just something interesting to note. Anyway, follow the Knight into the light world until they hide away in the shelter at the southernmost point of Hometown. Susie slams on the shelter door and reveals an electronic lock. There are 3 symbols that each need a code: a pine tree, a police badge, and a Deltarune. The door then opens for Chris. Something that's very important to know about the Knight after escaping with Undyne is the fact that the Knight would have to be extremely strong in the light world to still be able to bring Undyne to the shelter. We literally see Undyne bench press cars. We know she's extremely strong in both Undertale and Deltarune. The only way I think the Knight would be able to bring Undyne to the shelter would be if they retained their Dark World form, i.e. the extremely strong Knight. Regardless, after Susie leaves the shelter, the Knight, or someone who is working with the Knight inside the shelter, opens the shelter for Chris. Like I said, this combined with the way that Chris and the Knight act in the fight, confirms that Chris is in cahoots with the Knight to an extent. One last thing I forgot to mention, in the fight with the Knight, Chris is never swooned, and the Knight always makes sure to fight Chris last, which is further supporting that the pretty much canonical information that that Chris and the Knight are in cahoots with each other. In Chapter 4, Chris and Susie try to investigate a way to get into the shelter, presumably where the Knight's hideout is. Susie deduces that the Deltarune is likely related to the church, the pine cone is related to the mayor, and the badge is related to Undyne. This likely means that the Knight would have to have relations with all these respective symbols. We later learn that the code for the pine tree is in Dessa's guitar, and it can be inferred that the code is 1225. If we go to the closet Dark World and talk to King, he tells us that Jevil originally told him about the Knight's brilliance and the fountain's glory. This implies that the Knight and Jevil had some sort of relationship. When we enter the Dark Fountain in the church, we encounter the Knight yet again. If we manage to reach the Knight, Chris refuses to fight again. We continue to chase the Knight this entire chapter, not learning too much about who they are or what their motivations could possibly be. If we talk to Gerson, we can learn that Susie saw them at the end of Chapter 3. This likely means that the Knight is a Lightner. When Susie goes to get the musical notes for the piano, we can make Chris think about the Knight. The Knight's helmet starts to come off, and then Chris starts to think about Jockington instead, as to not reveal the identity of the Knight. At the end of Chapter 4, when the Knight is cornered, Susie says that she could kick their ass in the light world. The Knight laughs at her, and then creates a dark fountain in the dark world. This leads to a Titan being created. This is the last we see of the Knight in Chapter 4. Using this information, a few assumptions can be made about the Knight. First of all, the Knight likely exists in the real world. One thing I didn't mention is at the end of Chapter 2, there's a closet that says a large person could fit in here. At the end of Chapter 4, there's the same text that appears for a closet in the church. Now, these two very similar texts appear where the dark fountains are created in the light world. So it likely means that the Knight exists in the real world and isn't just some being that only exists in the dark world. We see that the Knight creates the dark fountain at the end of Chapter 4, which means they must be a Lightner, as only Lightners can create dark fountains. We also know that Susie saw the Knight in the light world, which means there has to be some light world version of this Knight. Secondly, the Knight likely had some relationship with Gerson. When Alvin talks about Gerson, he states that he passed on a few years ago. We know from Rousey that darkness patterned after the memory of a loved one tend to only appear in very specific darkness. Essentially, the Knight had to have some deep connection with Gerson in order to bring him back in the dark world. Using all this information, we can try to theorize who the Knight is. One of my favorite parts about this game being released in chapters is it gives the fandom time to discuss the content and digest it in chunks. Using the information available, we can create a few theories on who the Knight could be. Note that with each candidate listed, I'll give pros and cons to support each character being the Knight. Though I've sorted these from least likely to most likely in my personal opinion, I encourage you to do your own research and draw your own conclusions. Just because I don't think the Knight is someone doesn't necessarily make it true. There's enough evidence to suggest the Knight can be multiple different characters we've seen so far, which is what this video is aiming to dissect. So anyway, with all of that out of the way, let's get into the fun stuff. Alright, Candidate 1. Papyrus. Though it's more commonly seen as a joke, this theory still does have some merit to it. Without Papyrus even so much as showing up in Deltarune, it's somewhat understandable how people can crawl to this conclusion. Despite the lack of narrative importance Papyrus has had so far, there is key information that is important to know. For starters, we've seen that characters from Undertale are like, for a lack of a better term, just like worse off. They're much more flawed. For example, Toriel's a wine mom, Sans is a douchebag, Asgore's kinda the same, but instead of people liking him, everyone thinks his negligence led to the disappearance of Des, more than likely. Imagine for a moment how Papyrus would adapt to this bleak world, being a shut-in with no friends that lives with his action figures. If you had the option to live in a fantasy world and get revenge on the world that's mistreated you, would you not? Knight, save for the antlers and weapon, bears a striking resemblance to Papyrus. We've seen that the Dark World forms of characters changes their appearance very little, which would explain why the Knight looks so similar to Papyrus. An argument could be made that the Knight's armor is the reason for those antlers, and it's just part of the helmet. We know that the Knight is wearing a helmet. We hear that from Chris's imagination of the Knight taking his helmet off. Also, something else to mention about the Knight, they have holes in their hands, which are similar to those that W.D. Gaster possesses. We know that Gaster has some sort of connection to the Papyrus and Sans due to Sans using Gaster blasters in Undertale. Gaster's role in Deltarune so far is really fuzzy, but perhaps there's a connection between him and Papyrus here. In Chapter 1, Sans tells us that he and Papyrus have just recently moved into hometown. We can arrange a hangout with Papyrus for the next day, but when we come back in Chapter 2, he says that something has come up and we can't hang out with him anymore. Quote, "By the way, about my brother. Looks like you won't be able to meet him today. Yeah, it's a bummer and things don't work out. Sorry about that. I'm sure you'll meet him someday. Maybe around when your brother comes home." Perhaps this is due to Papyrus being busy with a dark fountain in the library that day. In Chapter 4, after the church but before visiting Noelle's house, if you are to visit Sans and Papyrus' house, you get this flavored text. You hear nary a bone, no rattle, nor trousle, nor xylophone tickle. This could easily imply that Papyrus is at a church making a dark fountain. One last thing. Assuming the Knight does not keep its form in the light world, Papyrus makes quite a lot of sense to have the ability to bring Undyne into the bunker. Undyne mentions in Undertale that he's extremely strong, but is brought down by his innocence and naivety. Maybe if Papyrus lost his innocence, he would be just as strong as we see Sans in Undertale. Maybe even stronger. Within the fight with the Knight at the end of Chapter 3, some moves are strikingly similar to Sans's in Undertale. Alright, but here's the big problem. This theory sucks because Papyrus has no, and I mean no, narrative significance up to this point. It could be argued that Sans hooking up with Toriel at the end of Chapter 4 is leading up to some big reveal that Papyrus is going to have a more significant role in Chapter 5, but I mean, come on, this is a huge slap in the face that the main villain be introduced this late into the story. Papyrus has only been mentioned by Sans like once or twice, he just does not seem relevant enough to the story to be an important character. But I mean, it's theoretically possible, I just think that it would be terrible for the story. Candidate 2 is Asgore. Asgore, unlike Papyrus, has actually had a role in Deltarune so far. He's Chris's father and clearly has a good relationship with Carol. We know that Asgore is formerly the police chief, but was replaced for unknown reasons with Undyne. We can definitely theorize what led to his removal from his position though. It's likely that something with Des's disappearance, Noelle's sister, led to his removal from this position. Just bear with me for a moment while I get into like theory territory, but perhaps the reason he was fired from his police chief job was due to him knowing that Des is in the Dark World. But this, of course, was seen as laughably absurd. We can infer that the investigation at least led to his divorce with Toriel, and Asgore's obsession with the Des disappearance left trauma for Chris. This leads into some very big pros for the Asgore case as the Knight. So Asgore has motivation. We don't really know what the town thinks of Asgore, but perhaps they think he's a lunatic after hearing him talk about the existence of Dark Worlds. We know from Undyne in Chapter 2 that the idea of Dark Worlds is seen as crazy. Maybe bringing about the Roaring is Asgore's like really screwed up way of showing everyone that these worlds do exist and he was always right. Asgore could also easily just have all the codes to the shelter. He was formerly the police chief, which checks off the police badge. If the Deltarune is meant to be Toriel due to her religious ties, it's not exactly far-fetched to imagine that Asgore would have this code when he was married to her. And lastly, the Pine Tree. We know that Asgore is great friends with Rudy and is at least connected to Carol. He describes Carol as very nice once you get to know her, so his relationship with the Holiday family is very strong. Another piece of evidence is the previously mentioned closets that a quote-unquote large person could fit in. Asgore fits that description pretty much perfectly. Also, it makes sense why Chris would work with Asgore, seeing as he's their dad and all. Everyone that we can assume is working with tonight, i.e. Carol and Chris, have a strong connection with Asgore. We also know that Asgore has the Black Shard, something that comes off of the Knight's Blade if you are to defeat them in Chapter 3. Though this does raise a question why he's acting like the Shard is like some kind of like big grand discovery if he's been the Knight for a while. Him having the Black Shard does imply there's at least some connection between Asgore and the Knight though. Lastly, Asgore seems to be like the only person in town that would actually be strong enough to bring Undyne all the way across town at the end of Chapter 3. However, despite all of this evidence, I just highly doubt that Asgore is a Knight for a few key reasons. First of all, there's no logical reason why Asgore would look like the Knight in the Dark World. It could be argued that he's wearing armor, sure, but I don't think that floral shirt he's wearing has just like a singular bone underneath it connecting his body. Also, the horns on the Knight are far more deer-like and goat-like. I guess you could say the horns are like a part of his helmet, but like, where would his regular horns be hiding? Secondly, Asgore cares so much about his family, which includes Chris. I don't think he would have the heart to put his child and their friends in such dangerous situations. I mean, if we're meant to believe that Asgore is a Knight, he literally summoned a Titan to try and kill Chris and their friends. I really don't think Asgore is the kind of person who's just like bring about the end of the world just to try and prove a point. He cares far too much about bringing his family back together to risk it all. At the end of Chapter 3, we see the Knight trying to absorb Toriel. I, again, don't think Asgore, as much as he wants to get back with her, would hurt Toriel in any way. Next, I don't understand how he would have had time to open the Dark Fountain in Chapter 4 at the church. We clearly see him at the Holiday household, and unless he took a shortcut through the woods, it's very unlikely he could have run over to the church and opened a Dark Fountain before Chris and Susie got there. Lastly, a hidden prophecy message you can find in Chapter 4 heavily implies that Asgore is going to be a bonus boss or an antagonist in Chapter 5. I think Asgore will have a pivotal role in Chapter 5, but I hardly doubt it's going to revolve around him being the Knight. It seems too out of character from what we've seen, and the motivation he does have does not seem like something he would do. Candidate 3 is Rudy. So a little more grounded choice would be Rudy. Rudy is of course the hospital-ridden father of Noelle and Des, as well as the husband of Carol. Unlike Papyrus and Asgore, Rudy's motivation for being the Knight would make far more sense. His eldest daughter has been missing for years, his wife is stuck in the past, and he's dying. The Knight, of course, has similar antlers to the entire Holiday family, which of course makes all of them suspects. Outside Noelle, we've seen her in the Dark World. Also, when we see the Knight do like his loud roar thing before the start of the battle at the end of Chapter 3, we see this odd eye thing like in its stomach cavity. Perhaps this is like a tumor or has something to do with Rudy's illness, which is keeping him in the hospital. We also see from Gerson that dead people can still exist in the Dark World as completely healthy beings. Perhaps Rudy's illness doesn't slow him down in the Dark World. So getting on to some pros we have here, it's very convenient that the hospital is inaccessible in Chapter 4 after visiting the Holiday house. This means that we can't check if Rudy's actually still in the hospital like a good little reindeer. During this time we can't see Rudy, a dark fountain conveniently opens up in the church. One of the strongest pieces of evidence going against people like Asgore and Carol is that they would not have the time to be in two places at once when this dark fountain's open. So far, Rudy has not had any contradicting locations at one time. Also, I believe that Rudy, of the characters we've seen so far, has the best suited personality to match the Knight. He's very smug, saying if Susie touches Noelle, he'll kick her ass. At the start of Chapter 4, we also kind of see he's a smartass with Toriel. At the end of Chapter 4, we get to see the Knight's cocky personality. The Knight goes up the stairs, cross-armed, floating just right in front of Susie. And just before the Knight summons a Titan, Susie says that the only reason the Knight keeps running away is because the Knight can't fight them in the light world. After this, the Knight laughs, something we frequently see Rudy do. If Rudy is the Knight, he's likely laughing because she's right. Rudy is very weak in the light world, and Susie absolutely could kick his ass in the light world. This would also explain why he, for lack of a better term, aura farms as much as he can. He's weak in the light world, why not show off in the dark world? Another piece of evidence is that Rudy has access to all of the codes we see on the shelter. He regularly attends church, his best friend is the former chief of police, and his wife is the mayor. On top of this, Rudy would have connections to Chris, which would make sense why Chris, Carol, and the Knight would all be in cahoots. Perhaps Rudy is making himself sick by creating these fountains and venturing into the darkness looking for his lost daughter. Now, the biggest problem I have with this is two things. First, in chapter 1 when we first visit Rudy says it's very out of character for Chris to visit them. This implies they don't really have that deep of a connection with each other. This contradicts the relationship we know that the Knight and Chris have with each other. Secondly, the whole ending sequence at the end of chapter 3 really works against this. How would a sick, dying man like Rudy be able to take the strongest person in town to the shelter? Maybe Rudy injured Undyne in the Dark World. We see from Birdley and Snowgrave that powerful attacks can lead to consequences in the Light World. We see Undyne's spears stop near the exit, so it's not possible to think that Undyne was like knocked out or seriously injured before being taken into the Light World. However, Rudy running across town all the way to the shelter seems highly improbable. After church, he talks about how difficult it was for him to just have the energy at church to even attend the service. Due to how sick he is, I highly doubt that Rudy is a Knight, though with all the evidence we have for him, it wouldn't be completely out of the blue if he were a Knight. Candidate 4 is Carol. We still don't know very much about Carol other than the fact she's a workaholic and has been the mayor for quite some time. During chapter 4, when we try to get the code from Des's guitar, Chris rips us out and makes a phone call to someone. The person on the other line discusses how Chris needs their soul in the Dark World, as well as needing to prevent Susie from getting the guitar code. They also mention today we'll be opening a dark fountain at the church. We can likely assume this is Carol, judging off of the Weird Route ending, because it shows us Carol is the one talking to Chris on the phone. Combine this with the fact that the voice on the phone says they'll be there shortly and Chris tells him that Susie has a guitar that has the code to the shelter. Moments later, we see Carol. With this information, we can infer that Carol has to be the Knight, right? Well, we don't necessarily know that the person on the phone in the kitchen is Carol. We know the second call has to be Carol, but not necessarily the first. Even if the first is Carol, the sentences are so jumbled up it's kind of hard to get a general idea of what they're saying. Plus, her knowledge of dark fountains doesn't necessarily confirm that she's a Knight, but there's definitely strong evidence that points to her being the Knight. So let's go over to pros. The giant katana, I mean, come on. This is the most obvious piece of evidence you're going to pick up on your first playthrough. We just met the Knight, and now we're seeing this giant-ass sword that heavily resembles the weapon the Knight uses. During Asgore's monologue section in Carol's bedroom, if you go into the code of the game, you can actually see that there's a black katana beside her bed. This could be the same katana the Knight uses. Also, when we see Chris being knighted by the Knight, it would make sense for this character to be Carol. We clearly see that Chris and Carol have some connection with each other, the extent of which is kind of unknown though. It could be possible this is Carol reminding Chris of their place. Carol reminding them that they still have to fulfill the unknown promise we see discussed at the end of chapter 4. Being the mayor of town, Carol would likely have all the codes to the bunker. Seeing the connections she has, it's not at all hard to believe that she would be able to easily access the bunker. I do have a few problems with this though. Unless Carol has some super secret tunnel to go straight from her house to the church, it's impossible that she could have opened the dark fountain we see at the church in chapter 4. We can go straight from the holiday house to the church and there's already a fountain open. I find it seriously hard to believe that Carol would have been able to beat us there, just like I said with Asgore. Also, at the end of chapter 3, this theory has the same problem as Rudy does. Are we meant to believe like a 50 or so year old woman wouldn't be able to run and carry Undyne across town? I mean, on the bright side, at least she isn't hospital ridden like Rudy. There's also very little reason to suggest her Dark World form would be what the Knight is. Why would her appearance change so much? Also, I don't think the Knight's personality really matches Carol. Carol has a very serious, icy demeanor we see her exhibit like in the holiday household in chapter 4. The cocky personality we see the Knight exhibit does not really match what we know Carol is like from her little bit of screen time she's had so far. I definitely think there's a lot of evidence that points towards Carol being the Knight, but I think that some of them are mainly just red herrings, but I do think she's more likely than Rudy due to her not being sick. Carol could also have the same motivation that we talked about Rudy having with trying to find your lost daughter and all. Candidate 5 and my personal pick for the night is Des. So December Holiday is trapped in the Dark World. This is heavily implied by her presumably calling out for help via Spamton. Also at deltarune.com/Des we get to hear a track titled Find Her. Finally, in the code, quote-unquote unused text is found in the code for each chapter, which pretty much can be inferred to be Des. I'll throw up what the text says on the screen right here, but essentially what it's just saying is it's somebody calling out for help and hoping that somebody is listening to them because they're stuck in darkness and they've been stuck in darkness for years, potentially. Just from all of that, we can infer that Des is this person trapped in the Dark World. From the information that Noelle gives us, we can learn a little bit about Des's character. We know that Des was very protective of Noelle, often comforting her in scary situations, as well as being the shit out of Chris with a wiffle bat for terrorizing Noelle. We know that Des is missing from the light world due to the previously mentioned evidence, but also the fact that the Room Queen design based off of Noelle's search history has the calendar always on December 25th, or December holiday. Des, of course, being short for December, this implies that Noelle is constantly searching for her sister's name, desperately trying to find more information about her. Also, in Chapter 3, if you insert 1,225 points into the B rank room, it takes you to a mysterious room. In this room, you can find a gumball machine that dispenses something that is essentially described as a guitar pick. Then it disappears, as well as your hand. This is obviously linked to Des and her mysterious disappearance. When exploring Des's room, we learn a little bit about her character, namely that she seemed very close with Asriel, stealing his retainer. We also see stars decorating her room, something that is also present in Asriel's room. With this information, we can start to dissect why Des is the most popular and most likely candidate for the night. I believe that Des being the night just makes most narrative sense from what we've seen so far. We know just enough about her to where it makes sense if she's the night, and also enough to where it won't feel completely out of the blue if it turns out she's the night. Okay, some of the pros presented by the community I simply just don't agree with, and I want to get this off my chest and out of the way first. So first of all, the Knight and Des being left-handed. This one grinds my gears so bad. I held off on this one until now, but this is something that frustrates me when I see people who use this as undeniable evidence. Toby Fox is great when it comes to storytelling, but I don't think he's some genius mastermind that pays attention to every minute detail. I mean, look at the grammatical errors in this game. The theory goes that we see Des is likely left-handed, judging by the position of the mouse in her room. Then we're meant to believe that the Knight is also left-handed, when this simply is not true. Yes, they hold their weapon in the left hand, but when they actually attack, they use their right hand to slash. The Knight also holds their weapon in the right hand when Undyne appears, because the sprite literally just flips. If the dominant hand really mattered that much, then this would not be the case. Okay, enough of that tangent. I'm done with that. Okay, people say the weapon also looks like a wiffle bat. This one I can actually see being important. We know that Des beat the crap out of Chris with a wiffle bat when they would not stop lying to Noelle. So this connection is definitely there. However, due to how pointy this bat is, it's kinda hard to be certain what we're seeing here. Anyway, onto this solid rock hard evidence. The best piece of evidence I can think of is simply why would any of the previously mentioned characters look like this in the Dark World? It simply does not make any sense. We've seen that the appearance of characters hardly changes when entering the Dark World. It made far more sense for it to be Des, who we know has been trapped into the Dark World for years to make her body transform into this monster we see. This would explain why the Knight still somewhat resembles a holiday but is so contorted. On top of this, we haven't seen any other character in the Dark World be able to shapeshift the way we see the Knight does. To elaborate on this, in Chapter 2 we learn to create Dark Fountains you must have determination, like I said earlier. We see that Spamton tries to take Chris's soul in order to gain determination. Perhaps something similar is happening here, and the Knight took Des's soul, giving them the majority of their power. We know that King despises Lightners, so if the Knight to an extent was a Darkener, it would make sense why King adores him. When we hear Des calling out in the code and such, this could be what's left of her soul desperately calling for help. You can make a parallel between the control the Knight has over Des and the control that we have as a player over Chris. It could be possible that the reason Chris and potentially Carol are helping the Knight is because they're being manipulated. We know that the Knight has a tendency to manipulate characters, i.e. the King and Queen. Perhaps the Knight is promising to help them find Des if they can bring about their roaring by opening fountains. The Knight could easily be forcing Chris and Carol's hand with the sheer amount of power they possess. This is purely speculation, but it would be within the character of Carol to do anything to find her missing daughter. You know she's obsessed with keeping things the way they are in Des' room, and she would do anything to bring her back more than likely. This could also recontextualize the phone call happening in the kitchen. It could be Carol warning Chris about what's going to happen, and that Chris needs their soul in order to seal the fountain that they know the Knight is going to create tonight. The only problem with this is why hasn't the Knight just killed Chris if they're going to go around sealing the fountains they're making? We know the Knight hates being betrayed. The personality of the Knight also seems to match Des better than most characters. The Knight definitely acts like a smug teenager to an extent, like the pose they hit going up the stairs. I have a hard time imagining someone like Carol with her icy cold and serious demeanor hitting a pose like that. Recall that Rousey states darkness patterned after the memory of a loved one tend to only appear in very specific darkness. We see Gerson in the Dark World, so it's likely that Gerson was a teacher to Des. Alvin tells Chris it's been a few years since Gerson has passed on, and a shame Gerson could not be a teacher to them. He also states that Alphys has since replaced Gerson. It's likely that this happened somewhat recently, and within that time, that Gerson was still alive. It's possible Des had him as a teacher and formed a strong bond with him. A weaker piece of evidence, but something I think is important to note, is how similar the Knight's Crystal Nova attack is to Azrael's Hyper Goner from Undertale. We know that Des and Azrael have some sort of connection. Des has one of Azrael's jackets, as well as a retainer. They have some sort of relationship with each other. It may be far-fetched, but perhaps the Knight is similar to Flowey in Undertale. Flowey is the long-gone version of Azrael. Perhaps the Knight is the long-gone version of Des. Another connection between Azrael and the Knight can be made with both Burn in Despair and Black Knife. Take a listen to how similar these two are. Now there are a few issues. So it's implied that Asgore is being paid by Carol to investigate Des' disappearance. If we assume that all the phone calls Chris receives are from Carol, this would raise questions as to why Carol is paying Asgore to investigate the whole Des' disappearing thing if she knows that Des is the Knight. Perhaps Carol is trying to find a way to get Des back in a more literal way, ridding her of her Knight form that she currently possesses. Maybe the Knight form she has now is something that's been caused by being in the darkness for too long. It makes sense why Carol trusts Asgore with the investigation. We see that he has some knowledge of the Dark World, possessing a Black Shard. If you are to beat the Knight in Chapter 3, like we said, you get a Black Shard as well. Maybe Asgore fought the Knight and broke off a piece of their blade. Maybe the reason Asgore got fired from the police chief job was due to him knowing that Des is in the Dark World, but everyone thinks he's the cuckoo bananas. Carol knows he's onto something, which is why Carol and Asgore are working together to try and figure out how to defeat the Knight and get Des back to her normal self. Moving on, a big issue is how would Des be able to move around in broad daylight despite obviously being implied to be missing? This is the main piece of evidence I do concede is hard to explain. But, as we see at the end of Chapter 4, the Knight has the ability to open dark fountains within the Dark World. We also see Burley attempt to do the same thing at the end of Chapter 2. So it could be possible the Knight is just opening the dark fountains from the Dark World. However, there's still the issue if the large person can fit inside here rooms that we see in Chapter 2 and Chapter 4. If the Knight were just hanging out in a closet, someone would surely notice a giant black floating Knight flying around. And if it is Des in the Light World, someone surely would notice a kid that's been missing for years. Maybe the closet searches red herrings, but I kinda doubt it. We also know that the Knight has to have some form of Lightner form. We hear Susie mention that they're more than likely a Lightner. This throws into question my theory I presented about Des being some sort of fusion. Would the Knight's Light World appearance just be Des? And if so, how has nobody seen Des yet? If it is just Des, how is Des able to overpower Undyne?
Hey guys, it's me, Editor Glue. People say it's way too obvious, but that's just not true. I'm gonna be honest, I did not really get deep into Deltarune until chapters 3 and 4 dropped. And until I started researching after the chapters, I barely even knew who December was. I didn't even know that there's a chance that she could be the Knight. I thought she was just some background character. I don't think for the average player it's too obvious for her to be the Knight. I think that people saying that Des is too obvious to be the Knight have been in the community for so long, they've sort of just trick themselves into thinking the average player is going to find out that December is the Knight. When you analyze every single tiny little detail, I guess it could be obvious that Des is the Knight, but I feel like to the average player it is not as obvious as people try to make it out to be. I feel like Toby would intentionally put evidence to subtly hint at death being the night for the average player.
But with all of that said, we still have a lot to learn and a lot of unanswered questions about the night. The biggest one I'm looking forward to learning is why now? Assuming the Knight's any of the characters we've met before, it'd be kind of odd for the Knight just to randomly start opening these dark fountains and not do it prior to now. Would it not just want to make the roaring happen as soon as possible? We know for a fact that the Knight and Chris are in cahoots with each other. Why would the Knight be okay with Chris just sealing these fountains if they're supposed to be on the same side? Would the Knight not want to just kill Chris in order to get them out of the way and easily have the roaring happen? But anyway, with all that said, I want to hear what you guys think. I think discussion on the Knight's identity is very interesting. Perhaps there's a point I made you want to elaborate on or disagree with. Maybe I'm missing some important information. Please, 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 please let me know what you guys think in the comments. I look forward to hearing what you guys think. So yeah, smash that like button, clobber that subscribe button, and please let me know what you guys think. I'm genuinely curious to know what you guys are thinking about all this. And until next time, toodles!